With more than 30 years as an UK-based IT trainer, Mike has delivered thousands of courses and tutorials about Excel and Power BI. In this session, he will provide us an introduction to VBA coding language. Okay, now let's get started.
Hello and welcome. My name's Mike Thomas and I'm an IT trainer with 30 plus years experience. I've been working with Excel for more years than I care to remember, and for the past couple of years I've also been working with Power BI. The topic for my session is a beginner's guide to VBA. If you've not used VBA before, if you'd like to dip your toes into the VBA waters, if you'd like to know the basics of VBA and how it can help you automate in Excel, then this session is for you. But before I begin, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the organisers of this conference for one, organising the conference, and two, allowing me to participate as a speaker. I hope that you find my session fun and useful. Let's start with what VBA is. It's a programming language which is available not just in Excel but in many other Microsoft applications, and its primary purpose is for creating macros. If you're not familiar with the term macro, it's a way to automate a task. So say you had a process which, done manually, would take 10 minutes, and that process was something that you did every week. Over a year, that's a lot of 10 minutes. 52 times 10 is 520 minutes, which is nearly 9 hours. Using a macro, you could automate that process and save yourself a lot of time. Not only does a macro save time, it also ensures that the actions that make up the process are performed in the right order and none are missed out. A macro consists of a set of instructions written in a language that the computer understands, which in this case is VBA. Each instruction represents an action in the process that's being automated. Now, since the early 90s, Excel has included a macro recorder, which lets you create macros by recording keystrokes, mouse clicks, menu selections, dialog box selections, and so on. So in a nutshell, you hit start record, you perform the actions, and you hit stop record. And all your actions, your keystrokes, your mouse clicks, and so on, between start record and stop record are recorded and converted into VBA code. Most Excel users who want to perform some level of automation actually start out by using the macro recorder. But the macro recorder has limitations. It can literally only record what you can do with the keyboard and mouse. Plus, if the macro needs changing, you'd either have to re-record the lot or edit it. And editing requires knowledge of VBA. So, what will you learn today? Well, I'll start by giving you a tour of the VBA Editor. You'll learn about the different types of modules, which are where your macros are stored. I'll show you how to write simple macros from scratch that, with just a single line of code, refreshes all the pivot tables in a file. You'll learn about objects, methods and properties, and this is critical to your understanding of code structure. I'll show you how to create a button, embed it in a worksheet and attach a macro to it, allowing you or anyone to run a macro with a single click. We'll look at the VBA if statement, which lets you define actions based on conditions being true or false. Event-driven macros are macros that run automatically based on a predefined trigger such as opening a file, and I'll show you a simple example of how that works. We'll look at the importance of documentation. And finally, I'll take you through a few real-world VBA-based solutions that I've created over the years, just to show you what can be achieved with VBA. To write, view or edit VBA code, you use the VBA Editor. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can get into the VBA Editor. One of them is to press Alt and F11. And I can press Alt and F11 again to switch me back to Excel. The other way is to use the Developer tab on the ribbon. Now, the Developer tab is hidden by default, so if you want the Developer tab visible, you need to right-click in the blank area on the right-hand side of the ribbon, select Customize Ribbon, and put a tick in the Developer box and click OK. Once you've got the Developer tab there, click on Developer and then click Visual Basic. The Visual Basic editor has 3 windows. We have the Project Explorer, we have the Properties window, and we have the main code window. Macros, or procedures as they're called in VBA, live inside modules. So think of a module as a container for your VBA code. Here you can see 2 macros, both of which live in the module called Module 1. Now, there are different types of modules. There's Excel object modules, there's standard modules, and there's class modules. The modules can be displayed in list view or folder view, and the yellow icon at the top of the Project Explorer allows you to toggle between the 2 views. Let's look at Excel object modules first. For each worksheet in the file, there is an associated module. And for each module, we see the module name and the name of the worksheet that it's associated with. In addition to the worksheet modules, there's a module called This Workbook. And this module is associated with the Excel workbook itself, hence the name. The worksheet and workbook modules are created automatically. So that's the Excel object modules. Now let's look at the standard modules. In folder view, you'll find the standard modules in the modules folder. They have a different icon to the Excel object modules, which make them easy to identify. In this workbook, there are 3 standard modules. The question that I get asked a lot is, does it matter which type of module you use to store your macros? Well, although you can store any macro in an Excel object module, best practice is that the Excel object modules should only store event-driven macros. These are macros that run automatically based on a predefined event taking place. Now, what do I mean by an event? Well, I mean things like the file opening, the file closing, the file being saved, navigating from one worksheet to another, navigating from one cell to another, a new worksheet being added to the file. There's actually many more events than that. I've just mentioned a few of them. So, for example, if you wrote some code and attached it to the new sheet event, that means that every time a new worksheet was created in this file, that code would automatically run. That's actually something I did for a client. They wanted it so that every time a new sheet was added, that sheet got moved to become the last sheet of the file and then got renamed so that the sheet name was the current date. So that is Excel object modules. Use standard modules to store standard macros, and by standard macros I mean macros that don't run based on an event. One question that comes up quite often is, should I create more than one module? And there is actually no right answer. A single module can store multiple macros. A single module can store thousands and thousands of lines of code. I know some people who, within a single file, store each macro in a separate module. Others store all the macros in one module. And others use multiple modules to organize the macros based on functionality. Class modules are beyond the scope of this introductory session, so I'm going to ignore those today. And one other thing about modules is that if you want to change the name of a module, you do so via the name property in the properties window. So you'd select the module, click into the name field and just overtype the current name of the module and press enter. Module names must start with a letter and cannot contain spaces. Okay, I think it's about time that we looked at some VBA. This is a dashboard used by the executive team at Excellent Ice Cream. a US-based company that makes and sells ice cream. The sales data sheet displays all the sales for this year so far. Each day, the sales manager receives an Excel file containing yesterday's sales, and these are then manually appended to the bottom of the list using copy and paste. Then the sales manager clicks Data Refresh All to update the dashboard. Yes, I know there's easier ways to do this, but this is a VBA demo. It's designed to show you how to write a simple macro, so suspend your disbelief. Don't focus too much on the example, and let's just pretend that Power Query hasn't been invented yet. Now, the sales manager keeps forgetting to hit Data Refresh All, and therefore, when the new data's been added, the dashboard is out of date. So you've decided to create a simple macro and add a big red button to the spreadsheet which, when clicked, will run the macro. Now, it would be simple enough to record the macro, but that's not going to help you learn VBA, is it? So I'm going to switch to the VBA Editor, Developer Visual Basic, and I don't have any standard modules here. So I'm going to insert a module, and I'm going to create a macro called Update Dashboard. All macros start by typing the word sub, followed by a space, followed by the name of the macro. And as I said, I'm going to call this one Update Dashboard, and then press Enter. Now, macro names are not case sensitive. They can't contain spaces, and they must begin with a letter, very much like the module names. So I've called this one Update Dashboard, but to make it easier to read, I've capitalized the U and I've capitalized the D. It wouldn't matter if I typed it all in uppercase or all in lowercase, but it's actually easier to read in camel case. Now, once I pressed Enter, I get automatically added an open bracket and a close bracket, and then I get end sub, and all the code between the two lines sub and end sub is the code that will be run. Now, this is a very, very simple macro. It only needs one line of code, and the code is active workbook dot refresh all. What this means is refresh everything in the current file. It's the equivalent of selecting Data Refresh All from the ribbon. And in fact, if I'd recorded the macro, I'd have got exactly the same thing. Now, in this example, active workbook is an object. It refers to the current workbook or the current file. And refresh all is an action that you want to perform on that object. In VBA terminology, an action is known as a method. Now, if I delete refresh all and I delete the dot and then press the dot again, when you type the name of an object and press the dot, a list pops up. This list displays all the methods that relate to that object. The methods have a green symbol next to them. Now I'm looking for refresh all, so I can either scroll down and find it, or I can just type the letter R and it will take me down to the first entry in the list that begins with an R, and I can see now refresh all, and I can either double click on it or click on it once and press the tab key, and it puts it into the editor. Autocomplete, which is what we've just looked at there, is useful if you're not sure what method to select, or you're not sure how to spell it, or you just want to be lazy and select it rather than type it. One of the questions that I get asked a lot by newbies is, how do you know what to type? Well, there is some element of logic to it. You want to update or refresh the current file, so you start with the word active workbook, which, as I say, means current file. But of course, that means knowing words like active workbook, active sheet, and so on. So I'd say these days Google is your friend. Search for something like Excel VBA refresh all and you'll get several million results back. What I recommend new users do is store commonly used lines of code somewhere, whether it be OneNote, Word, or whatever. I guess it's a bit like if you were learning a new spoken language, you take those common phrases like, how much is a pint of beer, and you'd store them somewhere. Now, I'm going to add a little bit more to this macro. It's a good idea to let the user know that the macro is finished. So to do that, I'll add a message box command, and this displays a message box on screen. I want the message box to appear after the refresh has finished. So just after the word refresh all, make sure my cursor is there and press enter. And that gives me a new line. And the command I want to type is msgbox, then a space, and in double quotes, refresh is complete. So that tells Excel to display a message box on screen with the words refresh is complete. Now I've deliberately typed MSGBOX in lowercase. It doesn't actually matter whether you type the words like message box and active workbook and refresh all in uppercase, lowercase or camel case, because as soon as I click away from that line, it converts it to the right case. So if necessary, Excel will amend what you've typed and put it into the correct case. Now I'm going to just minimize the VBA editor and go back to the worksheet. To run the macro, I've got a couple of ways to do it. There is a keyboard shortcut which is Alt and F8. So if I press Alt and F8, it actually brings up a dialog box and lists all the macros in this file. There's only the one of them at the moment, but there could be more. I'm going to select the macro and click Run. And what that's done is it's refreshed everything and displays the message box. Now, if you can't remember Alt and F8, you can always go to Developer Macros. That brings up exactly the same dialog box and you do exactly the same thing. Select the macro and click Run. But both of those two methods do take a couple of clicks. Even the Alt and F8, you still then have to select the macro. And what happens if the user selects the wrong one? And then they click Run, something disastrous could happen. So instead of that, I'm going to create a button, put it onto the spreadsheet, and connect the button to the macro. To attach a button, I could use the Developer tab and click on Insert and use the Button tool in the Form Control section. But I don't do it that way. The main reason being you don't have as much control over the formatting. What I do is on the Insert menu, under Shapes, I choose one of those shapes. Now you can choose any of those shapes, but to keep it professional and in keeping with standard Windows interface, I'm going to go for one of these rectangles. I'll go for the first one. And then draw out the button. I can make it as big as I want or as small as I want, and I can always resize it at any point because actually it's just a shape at the moment. And if I want to change the color of the button, I'll go up to Shape Format, Shape Fill, and choose a color. Make it a little bit bigger, and then to put some text in the button, simply double click in the rectangle and start typing. So I will call it, I won't put refresh because many end users don't understand that. I'll say update the dashboard. And if I want to change the font and things like that, I can just select the text and I could make it bold. I could make it a little bit bigger and center it vertically and horizontally. Now at the moment, as I say, it's just a shape, so I will right click on that shape and select Assign Macro, choose the macro and click OK. So now that button, that shape, has got a macro attached to it. So if I hover over the shape, my mouse pointer becomes a hand, and if I click, it runs the macro. So that's a much faster way for end users to run a macro. Just add a button onto the spreadsheet. I now want to save the file, and as you can see, this is an existing file, VBA001, and it's a standard XLSX file. So if I hit the save button, instead of just saving, it pops up a message. This message is a little bit cryptic. The following features cannot be saved in a macro-free workbook. What is a macro-free workbook? Doesn't even explain that. And then VB project. Well, VB project is the Visual Basic project that we've just been looking at. And a macro-free workbook is a standard XLSX file. When Microsoft wrote Excel, they set it up so that in a standard XLSX file you cannot store VBA code, but that doesn't really make it clear on that message box. But that's basically what it means. So if I want to save this file with the VBA code, I need to click on No and go and choose Macro Enabled File Type on the next screen. If I click Yes, I will actually lose all the VBA code from this file. So I'll click No, I'll change the file type to Macro Enabled Workbook, I'll keep the same location and the same file name and click Save. Now at this point we actually have two files with the same name. One's the XLSX, the other's the XLSM, which is the macro enabled file. So I will delete the XLSX. We don't need two copies of the same file. And then it's this file I will be using. The first time you open an Excel file with a macro in it or VBA code in it, you have to enable the macros. Macros are disabled by default for security purposes. If I hadn't clicked Enable Content, then clicking the button or running the macro in any other way would not work. A message would pop up that says macros have been disabled. Now this is another Excel file, VBA002, and this is an XLSM file, so there's already macros in this file. In the previous example, I talked about methods. Methods are actions that are performed on objects, and in this demo I'm going to introduce you to properties. In VBA terminology, think of a property as an attribute of an object. Each property has a value, so for example, the range object has an address property, and the value of that property is the address of the cell, such as A1. The range or cell has a background colour property, and the value of that property is the colour of the cell. It has a value property, and that represents the contents of the cell. Let me give you an analogy. An iPhone has a colour property with a value of, say, black. It has a model property with a value of, say, 14. And it has a battery percentage property with a value of, say, 80%. Now, to illustrate how properties work, in B11 I've got a drop-down list that shows me GBP and USD. If I select USD and click Set Currency, it changes the currency of C4. If I change it to GBP and click Set Currency, it changes again the format of C4 to GBP, UK pounds. That is happening with a macro. So that button, Set Currency, it's the same type of button I showed you in the previous example, and it has a macro attached to it. So if I switch to the VBA editor, there is a macro called Set Currency, and that macro runs when that button is clicked. And what that macro is doing is saying if the value property, the value meaning the content, so if the value property of B11 is USD, then format C4 using that format, and that code means use dollar symbols. Otherwise, apply a format to cell C4 using that code, which is to display currency with a UK pound sign. Now, I'm going to create another macro in this file which will use object properties, hence me introducing them to you just now. And this macro will let the user choose what colour to use for the cell background for the summary area, which is currently in yellow. It's B2 through to C5. Now, it won't be carte blanche to choose any colour. It'll be a choice of yellow or light green. I'll need the RGB values of the two colours, which I've got from a website, but there are many other ways to get those values. I've assigned a name to B2 through C5 on the dashboard sheet. So if I select B2 to C5, it's actually called summary area. So let's switch back to the VBA editor and click below end sub. I could create another module, but I'm not going to. I'm going to write the second macro in module 1. Now, you don't have to leave a blank line between the macros, but it's probably a good idea to do so just for readability. So if I type sub and then create the macro name of summary area yellow. So what this macro is going to do is it's going to set the color of the summary area to yellow. So if I press enter, it puts in my open bracket, close bracket, it puts in end sub, and it also puts in this solid line to separate this macro from the previous one. And the code is going to be range, open brackets, open quotes, summary area, close brackets, close quotes, close brackets. So that is the object dot interior dot color equals, and then the code is RGB open brackets 255 255 0, which is the RGB code for the yellow. So as I say, in this macro, range summary area is an object. It represents the range that's been named summary area. Interior is a property of the range object. And without getting too technical, because this is a session aimed at VBA newbies, in some instances a property can return an object. So range summary area dot interior is actually an object. It refers to the background of the range called summary area. And color is a property. The value of the property is RGB 255255 Now, to save me typing another macro, I'll just copy that code, literally highlight it, Control C, click below and paste, Control V. Change the name of the macro to summary area green and change the RGB to 144 238 144, which, as I said, I got that from the internet. Now, having two macros would mean having two buttons. So it's actually better to create one macro which swaps the color. In other words, if it's yellow, make it green, and if it's green, make it yellow. So I'm going to create another macro called summary area color. So sub summary area color and press enter. So as I say, what this macro is going to do is it's going to say if the background color of the range called summary area is yellow, make it green, otherwise make it yellow. So I use the if statement, the Visual Basic if statement. Now, after the word if, I want to say if the colour of the summary area is yellow. So the quickest thing to do is actually just copy that line of code there and put it after that. So if the colour of the interior of summary area is yellow, then I have to press enter for a new line. Then what I want to do is I want to make it green. So I will copy that bit and paste and change that to the green code 144.238.144. Close brackets. I had a close bracket. It's on the next line. That's better. Press enter, else, and then I will copy that line of code there. So I know I've not gone into too much detail, but what we're saying when we use an if function is we say if this is true, then perform all the actions between then and else. I've only got one action, but there could be many. Otherwise, so that's what the else means, perform all the actions between else and end if. Now, what a lot of people do is they indent the lines of code between the then and else and between the else and end if, and that's just for readability. So if I click before the R of range and press the tab key, that indents, and do the same thing on that line. Just makes it easier to read, no other reason than that. And then I don't actually need these two macros, I can delete them. So I have two macros here in module 1. One macro sets the currency, that's also using an if statement. And this macro is saying if the colour of the range called summary area is yellow, then set the colour of the summary area range to green, otherwise set it to yellow. Then I'll close the VBA editor down and I will right click on the shape, it's not actually a button yet, and assign macro. Select the macro called summary area color, that's one I just created, and click OK. And then to test it out, I will click the button and you can see it's changing the color. It's switching between the two colors. So if it's yellow, make it green. If it's green, make it yellow. Now earlier I talked about events and how you can attach macros to them. So now let me show you a very simple example. I want this file configured so that every time it's opened, the cursor is placed in B2 on the dashboard sheet. So let me switch to the VBA Editor. I need to attach my code to the Workbook Open event. Now you'll find the Workbook Open event in the This Workbook module. So I'll double click on this workbook and it's in there because it relates to the workbook and not a specific sheet. Now if I click on the drop down arrow at the top, there's actually two drop down arrows, one to the right of general, one to the right of declarations. If I click the drop down arrow next to general and choose workbook, it actually selects Workbook Open for me. But there is on this drop down a whole load of other events. So these are all the events that are associated with the workbook. So for example, if I chose new sheet, it creates me the code skeleton or code stub as it's called for the workbook new sheet event. If I choose close, I can find it before close, there it is, then I get the code stub for the workbook before close event. So if you write any code in here, that code will run immediately before this file is closed. So after the user has issued the close file command, but before the file is actually closed. As I said earlier, if you add any code in here, then that code will run when a new sheet is added in this file. But it's the workbook open event I want to use, so I'll just delete the other code stubs. I'll click into the line between the sub and end sub, and as I say, I want the macro to position the cursor into the dashboard sheet and position it on B2. So the first line of code will be sheets, open brackets, open quotes, dashboard, close quotes, close brackets, that's the object, dot select. That tells it to select, which is the name of the method, select that sheet. Then I'll press enter, and the next line will be range, open brackets, open quotes, B2, close quotes, close brackets, that is the name of the object, dot, and then select again. Select means go to. So we now have 2 lines of code that will run every time this file is opened. As I say, the event-driven procedures must be stored in the appropriate Excel object module. So in other words, this workbook or the appropriate sheet module, they won't run if they're stored in a standard module. However, normal procedures like the ones that I've created today will run if they're stored in this workbook or one of the sheet modules. It's just not best practice to store them there. So I will close the VBA editor down, and then I will deliberately place my cursor not on the dashboard sheet and make sure it's not on B2 in the dashboard sheet. I'll put it in A1 on the data sheet and save the file. Close the file down, and what should happen now when I open the file is the cursor jumps straight to the dashboard sheet to B2. So instead of the cursor being left on the cell that it was in when I closed and saved the file, it's actually run that code automatically when the file is opened. Now, one area that often gets neglected is documentation. If you're writing a large application containing a lot of code, it might be an idea to create some documentation, say in Word. But the VBA editor allows you to add documentation, known as comments, right inside the macros. To do so, begin the line with an apostrophe. So what I'm going to do is put a blank line at the top of the summary area color macro, type an apostrophe, and type a comment. This macro switches between yellow and green. Now, you can have as much or as little documentation as you like. If you wanted to have multiple lines of documentation, just make sure you begin each line with an apostrophe. If I move away from that line, it changes to green. That can be configured in the settings, but the default is that green is for comments, and it just means that the comments are easily identifiable. You can, if you want to, put comments on the same line as the code. Just leave a space after the code, although I tend to leave 2 or 3 spaces just for readability. Type your apostrophe and then type your comment. And I'm going to put here 2550 is yellow. And on the next line, I'll do a similar one. 144238 144 is green. Adding notes now, today, as opposed to going back and doing it in 6 months' time, will benefit both you and anyone else who might take over the managing of the file in the future. It might seem non-important, but believe me, future you will thank current you. Now, before I wrap up the session, I'd like to show you a few examples of where I've used VBA to solve problems for both myself and for clients. The files that I'm using are demo files, however, they are based on real-life scenarios. Let's start with Multiselect dropdowns. Most users can create drop-down lists using data validation. But creating a drop-down list which allows multiple selections isn't so easy. and I've been asked many times how to do this, and each time I've turned to VBA. So Excellent Ice Cream have opened a training centre, and their courses are available in multiple languages. The cells in column B have got drop-down lists via data validation, and the lists are based on the languages in column I. Now, some of the courses are available in more than one language. So for example, if I select English and then I click the drop-down and select German, what it does is it adds German instead of just replacing English with German, which is normally what happens with data validation. It adds a comma, a space, and then German. The Parfait and Sorbet 101, that course is available in German and in Spanish and in French. If I make a mistake, or if one of those languages is no longer available, I'd have to delete the contents of that cell and then reselect what is available now. To show you the VBA behind that, I'll go to Developer and Visual Basic, and that is the VBA code. I'm not going to go through it, but it is running on the worksheet change event of the sheet called Dropdown Multiselect. And the worksheet change event kicks in whenever the contents of a cell change. So what it's doing is it's basically capturing the current value and then adding a comma and the space and adding the next selected value. Now, a few years ago, a client asked me to create a button that allowed users to quickly switch the row and column on a pivot table. So I created a macro and I have a button, and as I click the button, what it's doing is it's swapping flavor and state. So if you want to see the code for that, I'll go to the Developer tab, go to Visual Basic, and that is a fairly straightforward macro. What it's doing, it's saying if the flavor is on the row, then set the flavor to the column and the state to the row. Otherwise, set the flavor to the row and the state to the column. The reason that I've got the horizontal align left and align right is because what I was finding was as I click the button to run the macro, it's obviously doing some kind of refresh in the background and it was setting the alignment incorrectly. So I wrote the macro lines to fix that. In this file, we have some data in the raw data sheet, and this data gets updated each week. The two dashboard sheets contain pivot tables, and both sheets are protected. Now, whilst those sheets are protected, we can't update the pivot tables. In fact, the pivot table analyze menu isn't even there. And if I go to data and refresh all, it tells me that I can't do this on a protected sheet. Now, what I could do is I could manually unprotect the two sheets, update the pivot tables with a refresh and reprotect the sheets. But what I did is I created a macro that does it. So let me show you that code. This is the macro that does that. What it does is it basically loops through all the sheets and turns the protection off. Then it applies a refresh and then it protects all the sheets. But because I don't want the raw data sheet protected, because that's got the data in it, I then unprotect that sheet. It's actually quicker than just going through each sheet individually and protecting it. Now, this next example is an action tracker, and this was created many years ago, way before the advent of smartphones and to-do apps. A client wanted to be able to record action items and have a button that moved completed items to another sheet. So when I click the button that has a macro behind it, in this case it tells me I've selected an invalid row. So what I need to do is mark a task as completed, and then click on Move to Completed, and it moves that record to the completed sheet. And then I'll pick another task and do the same thing. And what this is doing is moving it to the next row down. So it's basically cutting and pasting it into the next blank row on the completed sheet. Now, this macro demonstrates how, using VBA, Excel can control Word. So what I've got here again is a set of actions, a set of tasks, and for whatever reason the client wants those in Word. I could copy and paste them, of course, manually into Word, but I don't even have a Word document. So I'll click on Create Action List in Word, and what it does is it actually creates a new Word document which it sticks on my desktop, and that document has got a copy of the data in it from Excel. If I go back into the file and show you the code, this is the code here. So what it does is it selects the data in the Excel file, then it creates a running instance of Word behind the scenes, creates a new document. Having copied the data from Excel, it pastes it. It then saves the file onto the desktop using the file name Actions, closes the document and exits Word. The final example I want to show you is how you can collect information using a form. So this file was used to collect information about employees in readiness for their annual appraisals. I've included this one, as I say, to demonstrate user forms. So I click this big button here, you can't miss it, and it launches a form. User forms are forms that are created using the VBA editor, and as I say, they're primarily used to collect data. Forms can include text boxes and radio buttons and drop downs, and this form even has multiple pages, so users can navigate between the pages using the tabs or the buttons at the bottom. Clicking the Submit button on page 3 will take the data from the form fields and store it on the next blank row of a hidden sheet. Now all the users use the same file, so the original file had the data sheet password protected so that only the manager was able to see the responses. So the reason I've shown you all of these is not to show off, but to show you really what Excel and VBA is capable of, that it can do much, much more than just automate what you can do with the macro recorder. So that brings us to the end of this session. VBA is a massive subject. You know, you can't learn it all in an hour. The purpose of today was just to get you started, to help you understand the terminology and get familiar with the VBA editor. So thanks for watching, and if you want to contact me with any questions, please do so. All my details are here. And as I say at the end of my YouTube videos, have an excellent day.
Hi everyone. Please scan the QR code on the screen or access it via bit.ly link to give us some feedback for the next event, as well as the feedback for Mike. Hi Mike, are you here?
I am here, yeah.
Would you like to share your camera?
Yeah, there we go.
Yep. How are you today?
I'm good, yeah. I hope people enjoyed that. I hope people found that useful.
Yeah, I learned a lot from it. Yeah.
Good.
Everyone, please leave your questions in the Q&A box if you have any. I personally have some questions for you. What are your top 5 tips in writing a clean code that perform well and read fast?
Writing code, sorry, did you say?
Yeah, in VBA, yeah.
Keep it simple, I would say. Don't use the recorder, and if you are going to use the recorder, remove the things that you don't need. So for example, one of the demos that I often do is how to do text to columns. So using the recorder, it's how I introduce macros. So using the recorder. Yeah, I just see that coming from Liam. The thing with the recorder is that it records a lot of extra code. Now, if you know what you're doing, then you can just strip out that code. You know, a good example of that is if you went into, for example, the page setup dialog box because you wanted to record, and this is something I did for somebody years ago. If you wanted to record changing from landscape to portrait, it actually records not just the fact that you switch from landscape to portrait, it actually records every single setting in that dialog box, regardless of whether you've edited it or not. So I guess my number one tip is, I was going to say don't use the recorder, but actually the recorder is a good way to learn, and the recorder is also one of those things that I do use occasionally when I've forgotten a bit of code. But tidy it up. I think tidy it up after you've got that code that it has generated. That's what I would say. Another tip, which is what I put in the session, is document, because you come back to something in a few years' time and you'll have forgotten what you did, what the purpose was behind what you were doing. And again, somebody at work a couple of years ago said, Mike, you wrote me some code about 6 years ago. I said, did I? He said, yes. He said, now we need some changes making to it. So it took me about an hour to get back into it, thinking, why did I write that code? So when I wrote the second bit of code, I documented it. I just put some notes in and said, you know, added by Mike Thomas, put the date in and said, you know, this is why I did that. So those, to me, those are the important things. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
there's
chat going on, I think.
Yeah, there's a comments in the chat box. The best approach is just stealing code from someone smarter online.
I can't disagree with that, Oscar. I can't disagree with that. I mean, a question was asked in the Q&A, and I didn't know the answer. So I went and did a quick Google, found some code, pasted it in, or pasted the link in the Q&A. Yes, you'll probably need to tweak it, but I won't disagree with you, Oscar. You probably need to tweak what you found, but yeah. Google is your friend.
I have just tested it quickly and it works. Thank you for that.
It works. You're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Can you share some of the examples that you use VBA in your daily job?
Yeah, I actually have a spreadsheet that I use for keeping track of training sessions that I do and videos that I put together, and my YouTube videos that I put together. And what I do is I have a bit like the action tracker that I showed in that session. I have one sheet that is currently active ones, so currently in development. And then I have another sheet that is completed ones, and I have a button that moves the in progress ones over to the completed sheet. So that's probably the one that gets used on a regular basis. But yeah, I've got all sorts of little VBA bits that I use now and again. I've also built myself a little invoicing system as well, again based on taking data from Excel into Word and generating an invoice in Word. So I'd say those two are the main ones that I use.
Thank you so much for showing up today and share some informative information. Yeah. Thank you so much.
You are.
Yeah.
You are very welcome. And you. Thanks everybody, and thanks Liam and everyone for organising this session.
Thank you. I will share the feedback form again. Hi everyone. Please leave the feedback via the QR code or the video link on the screen.